Hello and welcome to the latest in our Marketing Briefs webinars. My name's Bonnie Parker-Davis. I'm a content strategist here at Ledger Bennett, and today we're going to be talking about a spoonful of GDPR that helps the compliance box get ticked. So just before we get started today, I just wanted to quickly tell you about the webinar series that we've been running over the past few months now. So we are delivering a webinar series which is around 30 minutes long every 2 weeks. They are short, focused and free of all of that marketing jargon. So hopefully you'll find it beneficial and be able to implement some of the advice straight away. Some of the upcoming webinars that you might be interested in. So we have the interesting subject of demand centres on the 12th of October. We've got buyer journeys on the 7th of December, and all the way in January of next year, we're talking about marketing automation in some depth. If you're interested in any of those upcoming topics, then all you have to do is just drop us an email to demandmore@lbdga.com and we'll be sure to add you to the list. So just to quickly tell you a little bit about myself, as I mentioned, I'm a senior content strategist here at Ledger Bennett. My role is very much seated within content, so it's always about storytelling. But I'm heavily involved with a lot of the campaigns that are delivered across marketing automation platforms and also inbound as well. And I think this is where, particularly when we start to think about how to take prospects on a journey, this is where technology becomes really, really important. So today's panelist, who I'd like to introduce now, is Tim Bone, who is our Chief Marketing Technologist. Hello, Tim.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Bonnie, can I just interrupt and say I'm not seeing any slides right now?
Oh, you're not? Sorry.
No.
I beg your pardon. There you go. Can you see that now?
That's better. There we go.
Fantastic. Sorry, apologies to all. He's our Chief Marketing Technologist, as I explained. Tim, would you just like to tell people a little bit about yourself?
Certainly, yeah. So I head up the Marketing Technology Department at Ledger Bennett, which includes marketing automation specialists, web developers, data integration specialists, CRM specialists, and I help I'm the kind of interface between the clients and the development team to help build strategies, integrations and solutions for people. And as part of that, the subject of email legislation obviously comes into that realm.
Definitely, and it's certainly something that a lot of our clients are talking to us at the moment about. So just to explain the agenda that we'll be covering today, so we'll be talking about just explaining exactly what is GDPR and understanding the extent of the regulations themselves. Focusing then on some key compliance principles and really starting to understand what it is exactly you need to be doing. Then bringing GDPR into your campaign. So how does it impact them? What you need to start thinking about. And then this is where Tim's expertise absolutely comes into play. So really starting to think about how marketing automation platforms can actually support your campaigns in this kind of environment and making sure that actually some of the elements that you need to deliver can be automated. And then finally, we're just going to leave you with some quick thoughts about some of the things you need to remember when you're thinking about GDPR. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I get going?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
Okay, so let's start off with then what is GDPR? So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU regulation, and it was adopted in April of this year, and it builds on existing data protection frameworks that were already in place in the EU. And the important thing here to remember is there is a 2-year grace period in which companies must implement the new processes. So we're talking about 2018, May 2018, when you have to be fully compliant by. So they call this a transitionary period. What is GDPR? So it builds on previous EU data protection regulation. So that's the thing we've been using. Sorry, EU Data Protection Directive, I should say. And there is a difference between that legislation and GDPR, as GDPR is automatically adopted into laws of the member countries, whereas the EU Data Protection Act directive had to be individually adopted into each separate company's legislation. Its primary objectives, as stated, are to give citizens back the control of their personal data and to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by unifying the regulation within the EU.
Wow. So in other words,
Yes.
it's just about making sure that we have this consistent level of rules across all of the different countries within the EU.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the previous EU Data Protection Act directive, because it was adopted separately by individual countries, some were quite loose about how they adopted it, and some were quite strict,
Right.
based on cultural reasons. The Germans are always very more stringent than we are. So this sort of set more of a level playing field
Okay.
across the EU.
So it feels like it definitely makes sense then.
Well, yes, from the user's point of view, yes. So let's talk about compliance. So this has changed quite significantly from previous legislation. So the failure to comply could be very costly. So there are a few different grades of fining, but the top grade for failing to comply is up to 20 million euros or 4% of worldwide turnover.
Wow.
And the important thing here is that multinational organizations are treated as a single entity. So they will look at the turnover of the entire group of companies rather than just the individual country location.
Right. Okay.
So let's look at some the key compliance principles, right? So, and this is a very important one, the number one. So compliance is not based on the location of the business, but the location of the data subjects. And the data subjects is the way they talk about in the legislation, but what that actually means is the people. So the users or the contacts. It doesn't matter if you're based in the UK, and at some point we may not be in the EU, but this legislation applies to any company processing EU EU data subjects, i.e. people that live in the EU. If you're processing their data, then you have to be compliant.
Okay, so if we've got an American company maybe processing data of French prospects, then this still applies to them.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Another important one is this is a new change as in GDPR is that there's no distinction now between business and personal email addresses. So previously there was a kind of a grey area, but you could say, oh, this is a business email address, so it's not personal data, so we can get away with being slightly less stringent on opt-ins and things like that. But now they specifically say that if an address or something, or a username or ID or something like that is applicable to an individual, doesn't matter if it's a business or personal address, then it falls under GDPR.
Okay, so that is a big difference then.
Yeah. And a generic business address such as @info that goes to a group of people or a business does not fall inside GDPR.
Right.
But obviously they're the kind of addresses that we try to avoid anyway. But yeah. Businesses may be required to designate a data protection officer. Now there's various criteria for this, such as size and the kind of data that you're processing, and it doesn't have to be a defined role that they only do that job, but they have to, businesses may have to designate someone as a data protection officer who then takes responsibility for enacting GDPR.
Right.
So then let's look a little bit more detail into some of the more what this actually means in practice. So in terms of opt-ins, this is obviously one of the key pieces. All contacts must provide consent to be emailed. And critically here again, which is more of a clarification, is that the sender who's sending that email must be able to prove consent. And this means keeping information about how that consent was provided, when was it provided, what was the action and interaction that took place for that consent to be allowed.
Okay, so it's really important then to have that audit trail of being able to absolutely bulk that time and date consent was given.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where your marketing automation platform really comes into play.
Yeah.
And no soft opt-in. So previously we got away with the idea of, well, implied consent.
Mhm.
So maybe you complete a form and there's a privacy policy or something that says in the background, oh, okay, well, by doing this, we're assuming that you're allowing us to send you information. That is specifically uh, not allowed as part of GDPR. So users must actively opt in, which normally means they have to have a clear action on a form to do that. So meaning ticking a box that says, we would like to send you some information or communications.
Okay.
And the right to be forgotten. So again, this is another real sort of shifter in the landscape a bit really here. So everybody, if they contact you, and how they do that is something that is still has to be made clear. But if they contact you and say you need to remove me from your databases, then you must do it. And that doesn't mean unsubscribe as we would do today. It actually means deleting all traces of that person from the database. And one of the interesting challenges there is once you've deleted them, if you don't have a record of them anymore to say they want to be forgotten, what's stopping them from re-emerging back into your databases again through some other means? So there's an interesting challenge there. Again, I don't have a particular solution to that, but that is a new requirement. So right to be forgotten.
Do you think closer to the time more information will come out around that area so that we've got more clear guidance?
Yeah, possibly. So previous legislation, such as the email cookie directive, for example, what ended up happening was everyone looked to the authority within their country for guidance. So the ICO provided information on how to adopt that, and hopefully they will start thinking about those things. But also what may happen is larger companies may start doing this and putting out white papers, and people might start to see a solution, or even vendors might do it as well. So
Okay.
there may be a way, for example, of what's called hashing an email address. So you don't actually know what the email address is, but you can compare an email address to that hash, and maybe we keep a list of people that have been asked to be forgotten, and we can compare any images coming in to that list. But that would be something adopted probably within vendors.
Okay.
So you may be asking yourself, what does this mean for my campaigns? There's plenty you need to consider, including channel, forms, system integration, and events as well, because this isn't just in the online world. There is, if you're capturing personal information and bring them into a database, then that falls under GDPR. So if you're capturing business cards or sign-ups to events, it all needs to be considered as data that needs to fall under this legislation. So how GDPR impacts your campaign? So in outbound, the next one. So when I'm talking about outbound, I'm talking about data that you already have and sending out emails or communications from that data. So what do we need to consider right now, today? So what consent already exists for those contacts? If you haven't had this sort of consent in place or opt-ins in place in the past, or it hasn't been adopted across all of your forms or interactions, what do you have today, and when was it given? Is it relatively new, or is it quite old? And so on the basis of those, can you now legally communicate with them? And obviously another part of that is, where are they? If they're not in the EU, if they're in the US, then maybe you don't have to worry about it. So there's a whole process of audit there to work out where we are today. That's from when I talk about outbound, that's existing data. Then I'm talking about inbound, which is people that you're now acquiring through conversion forms or whatever online as new data. Let's make sure that consent is sought properly, and it's sought always. So whenever you're capturing a name, email address, anything else, company name, or telephone, that we are seeking consent to continue communication with those people. And that's really getting some governance about all the places you're converting people in the online environment. And as I said before, including events and offline acquisitions. So if there's something you're interacting with somebody in the real environment, maybe taking a business card or whatever, or signing up to someone for an event, let's seek consent there as well. Let's get everything aligned. And also, as we said before, keep an audit trail. So somewhere in your master database, whether that be marketing automation or a data warehouse or a CRM system, keep an audit trail of where that consent came from. So what was the action, what was the date and time, maybe what was the call to action, what was the content piece that made them convert. And then you also got to consider partners as well. So if we're talking about channel, if you're currently in a situation where you're sharing leads with a channel, then we need to consider how that's going to work. So maybe in your consent box, you have to explicitly talk about who you're going to share with. Again, it's not completely clear at this point in time today how GDPR affects that kind of relationship with data down channels and data providers as well, third parties. So that's going to get increasingly difficult to do. So the idea of buying data, purchasing lists, the writing's been on the wall with that for a while now, but this legislation is just one further thing that just makes list purchasing very problematic and dangerous from a commercial point of view. So how MAP can support your campaign. So marketing technology, it can't make the problem go away.
Although you might like it to.
But it can automate parts of the process. So obviously, this isn't just about, integrating some technology, adding in some clauses here and there. There are processes and human interactions involved in all this as well. But marketing automation can allow data from different geographies to be treated differently. So this is an important part. So if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you what I mean by that. So if we look at, this is a map of the world here in terms of data privacy legislation that's going on right now. So the redder, the more stringent. And surprisingly, North America's in there, but I guess as being stringent, where it isn't relatively compared to Europe. But obviously compared to Russia and parts of Asia, it's more stringent than them. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if you're a global business, GDPR only applies to the EU. So let's not strangle ourselves by GDPR in the rest of the world. So marketing technology, marketing automation, if you implement it right, you can only apply the framework for the country of the person that they're in. So what I mean by that is if you're capturing country, you can say, right, well, I know this guy's in Russia, so therefore I don't need to do all these extra processes. But if I'm capturing them, I know they're in the EU, then I will apply these particular processes in place.
Okay, that makes sense. Or I guess
hopefully,
what you could do is just apply it to everybody.
You could apply it to everybody, but obviously, why seek consent in regions or areas where you don't really need to, right? And the other point to make is that there are still certain local legislations in place, even on top of GDPR. So Germany, for example, still does require a double opt-in, whereas double opt-in is not necessarily part of GDPR. So that means the idea of that you have to email them back once they've opted in to doubly confirm. And obviously Canada has its own slightly different legislation as well to North America. So the point I'm trying to make here is that marketing technology done right can make some of this stuff a lot easier to implement on a global basis.
Makes sense.
So let's look at what we should be doing in MAP then in terms of opt-ins and opt-outs. So really standardizing that conversion process. So getting a handle on where your forms are, how those forms are implemented, standardizing the opt-in process, the privacy process, the communication and messaging around that conversion, and storing those opt-ins within MAP. As I said before, ask country. If you're a global business, make sure you're capturing country at every single, even if it's a very low gate where you're just asking email address. If you ask the country, you'll have a better idea of what legal framework you're operating in for that contact. And build in privacy by design. So what I mean by that is if you're relying on the fact, for example, that people pulling segments or lists in order to do communications, and you're relying on them to know what they need to be doing in terms of checking for opt-ins, checking for what country that person's in, then setting yourself up in quite a large risk there. If within a marketing automation platform, you can build in the fact that says, well, I'm not going to allow you to send to that contact because I know they're in the EU and I know they're not opted in. So let's automate the process of validating those opt-ins rather than relying on a human process. Support inbound. So what this legislation does is it pushes, again, it's a slow creep, but pushes the emphasis now less on data and buying data and manipulating data and cleaning data to the idea of inbound marketing. So let people come to you, let them convert through your forms, and then provide consent at that point. And it's a win-win situation because inbound leads, so either from content or from social or whatever it might be, they convert to sale at a much higher rate than data that you've had kicking around for a while or you've acquired from somebody else. And process old data. So a few things you can do there to sort of clean up what you've got. Carry out an opt-in campaign for neutral leads. So if you don't know if they've opted in or not and they've been sitting there for a while, you could do right now, today, within this transitionary period, you could email everyone out and say, hey, we haven't heard from you for a while, or we've never heard from you. We'd like to send you this information. Please confirm if you'd like to receive it or not. And if they say no, then you can put them in a pot and move on, clean that data out. Remove hard bounced or opted out data. So this is something, again, that doesn't happen very often. A lot of clients will just sit there with this data that they know is pretty bad. It's either hard bounce, or either the email address doesn't exist anymore, or people have just unsubscribed, and it'll still sit there in the system. You might as well get it cleared out and get that database cleaned up and a bit leaner, more streamlined. Or remove very old dormant contacts. So if no one's responded to anything for 3 years, 4 years, whatever it might be, what's the point of keeping it?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that one. We recently went through an exercise similar to that in our own database, and I think I must have cleared out maybe 15, 20,000 records, so there was quite a few in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So things to remember. Enforcement starts 2018. You have time. 25th of May 2018 is when enforcement starts.
That's the key date then to remember.
That's the key date, yeah. Stick it in your diaries. Start auditing now. Obviously, there's a big process to go through here, so don't wait till a month out. Let's just get going now. Consult with your suppliers. So again, there's a few things that come up in this presentation, but there are things that vendors should be doing now. And I've talked to a few vendors. I was talking to Marketo last week, I think it was, and they've just gone through and audited their entire systems to make sure they're compliant with GDPR. That doesn't mean that if you use Marketo, you're automatically compliant with GDPR. It just means they've got their systems and processes in place. You still have to make sure that your processes are in place using their tool. And don't forget the human side of compliance as well. So, training, awareness, procedures and processes, handling of data, sending around data spreadsheets via email is risky, and everybody does it, but it's a risky thing. So there is a whole other side of it outside of marketing automation.
And obviously, I'm guessing then any data that's held in spreadsheets anywhere is still bound by GDPR.
Yes, because GDPR is not just about email, although we've been focusing on that today. It's a whole wider framework in terms of data privacy. And if you when we're talking about compliance and fines and all that kind of thing, that is about a data breach, right? So some people's data, personal data, getting out there when it shouldn't be. Now, the risk is really down to the size of data that you're talking about, the kind of data. So things like credit cards or medical history is obviously covered by GDPR. and that's far more sensitive and far more liable to be to hit a fine. And when we're talking about B2B marketing, we're not really talking about that kind of sensitive information, but it all falls under the same banner.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. Wow. Okay. Well, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour.
Yeah.
So what we've covered then is we've explained, or rather Tim has, what GDPR actually is, and some of those key compliance principles then that you need to think about. We've covered how GDPR can actually impact your campaigns and starting to think about then how MAP can actually support your campaigns and start to automate some of the processes to get you into that best practice scenario of kind of accommodating what is to come. And then just finally finished off with some things to remember. So we've got time for a very, very quick question, and just looking at some of them that have come in. Obviously, this is still an evolving subject at the moment. And the question that we have is where do you go for information about GDPR? Where's the best place, or perhaps some of the best places to go for kind of updates about how GDPR is going to be implemented?
Sure. Well, I mean, the classic answer there is Google. There's lots of funny enough, you'll find actually now there's a lot of lawyers and people like that putting out white papers and stuff talking about GDPR because it's a good piece of content for them to win business. And so there's a lot of stuff there. The ICO should be the ultimate place for the UK to provide UK government to provide guidance to us. They're obviously, the white elephant in the room here is it still going to apply to us post Brexit? Are we still going to be bound by GDPR? And no, there isn't. I haven't seen a single answer to that that's definitive yet, but I've seen a few opinion pieces that say there's a good chance we probably will adopt it for ease of working under a single environment, and obviously it's quite comprehensive. But the ICO and just googling around and finding interesting opinion pieces.
Okay, and I guess we'll be producing more pieces as well close to the time as well.
Yeah. I mean, like I said before, the cookie directive came out, and it's very broad, and the actual practical way to implement it was not really provided until the very last minute before full adoption was in place. This may well be similar, although I can see less technical issues with this one than there were with the cookie directive.
No, some good advice there. Okay, so that is it. That is GDPR. So just to kind of wind up, just wanted to let you know about some of the upcoming webinars that are in our calendar at the moment. So we will be covering demand centers, as I mentioned, on the 12th of October, looking at buyer journeys on the 7th of December, and marketing automation on the 25th of January. So if there are any topics that are of interest, or if you're interested in any of these three webinars, just drop us a line at demandmore@lbdga.com, and we'll be happy to add you to the invite list. And it's just down to me to say thank you very much for making the time to watch the webinar today, and thanks very much to Tim to dialing in and giving us his thoughts on the subject. Thanks, Tim.
No problem, thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you soon.